sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello, and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACO show that might as well face it, we're addicted to love. Joining me, of course, fresh off a brand new episode of Godless Bitches 3.0, V. La Bianca.
Hello, everybody.
V, tell us a little bit about GB3.
GB3 is very exciting, you guys. We launched the third iteration of Godless Bitches, one of the ACA's favorite shows. On January 5th, it premiered right after the AXP episode that day. And it features myself and a AXP host, Jenna Belk, and a new ACA member, Jen Aldridge. And the three of us get together and we talk about kind of the intersection of feminism and religion and politics and current events. So we talked last week about the separation of church and state when it came to funding public schools. We've got some really awesome topics coming up, including LGBTQ rights, anti-vaccination, and a bunch of different stuff. So yeah, that's going to be a regular thing now.
Awesome. So that's not this coming Sunday, but next Sunday, alternating?
I believe so.
Okay. Well, excellent. Very exciting thing to be a part of. And tonight, I'd like to introduce you to my friend and colleague, Kristen McAdams.
Hello.
Kristen is a licensed professional counseling intern with a host of former careers and past professional lives, many of those centered around addiction treatment. So tonight we'll be sort of discussing the state of affairs in the addiction treatment community, how the role of junk science and tacit state sponsorship of belief has changed the way that we look at our bodies and ourselves. So if you or somebody you love is in recovery or has been affected by addiction, please give us a call. We're at 512-686-0279. That again is 512-686-0279. Kristen, thanks so much for being here. Tell us just a little bit about your experience.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. I do have a very dynamic sort of background in addiction and psychology. I started at Boston University studying for pre-med, where I studied evolutionary psych and logic and communication, and then I went on to...
Three fields that very naturally go together, I
think. Many, yeah, and it's so funny because I've been to like almost every university in the country, I think, so I've taken like pieces from each one of them, so yeah, they all seem to have a common theme. I also went to Nova Southeastern University for my undergrad, where I specialized in substance abuse studies, where we studied culture and philosophy as well as social organizations and things like that. I got a certified addictions certification through the state of Florida. I don't have that anymore because I really don't need it. I got a master's here locally at St. Edward's, and I do private practice here as a postgraduate intern.
Okay, well, great. So we're going to be kind of diving into some of the problems that we see in the addiction treatment community. You know, before we get started about that, anytime we speak about addiction, I think it's really important to note that we're talking about sort of the general state of affairs, sort of the state of the science as it is overall. And we really don't want to comment necessarily on your specific experience. I know a lot of folks out there have had a lot of success with things like AA and the 12 steps programs and things along those lines. And we are going to be talking about those, some of the problems that we see and some of the ways that I think skepticism and evidence-based practices can maybe improve the way things are going. But we also want to just say that if you are in recovery or have been in recovery in the past, we're just glad that you have access to resources and that you're getting the support that you need. You know, while we kind of point out maybe some of the problems, I just want to be respectful of everybody's personal experiences and what that looks like. So with that, Kristen, what is sort of the modern identity of addiction treatment? What's the model? And is it fair to say that AA and the 12 steps are sort of the backbone of the way we see substance use?
So I do want to say that I'm really grateful that you mentioned the fact that we do respect everybody's approach and perspectives and things, because it is different for everyone.
Sure.
Everybody is a dynamic, unique individual, and because of that, you know, there's a variety of causes and variables that play into addiction as a whole. And I think that anybody that's going to be seeking help, self-understanding, self-awareness, self-actualization, I feel like that's just important, whatever that journey or that path looks like for you. In terms of AA, that's a whole different ballgame, and it means different things to different people. And it's definitely the oldest sort of system that we use to treat addiction, and I think that it's become quite outdated. I know that we tend to treat addiction through what's called a disease model now, but that's just one of many models that I think should be part of that evolution in terms of combining different ideas and moving forward with different approaches to how to handle this. And I think, unfortunately, we do default to AA. And while that does provide a lot of things for a lot of different people, like supportive community and a resource when you're feeling triggered or overstimulated, there's a place to go and there's a community, and that's important. I think that's not all it takes to handle any one individual problem when it comes to addiction.
Yeah, and just pointing out sort of the age of some of these ideas. I mean, when we're talking particularly about the 12-step model, we're talking about something that's over 100 years old, and that hasn't necessarily changed in meaningful ways. I mean, it's built on this sort of like spiritual understanding that was tied really into the Prohibition movement, which we know is attached to these ideas of feminism and got kind of complicated with all of this religious moralizing and just came from a very different era before, neurobiology and science was really the way that it is now.
Sure, yeah. We didn't have the modern technology or modern medicine to really understand what's going on neurobiologically or with the psychopharmaceutical industry and things like that. It is outdated now, and it was a time, at that time it was suited for that era and the lack of information exchange and lack of technology and things like that. So yeah, but it seems to have not gone away.
Yeah, which is, I think, the thing that frustrates and confuses me the most. Because, if you and I, as counselors, were still operating based on the same theories, I mean, sure, we might still read Freud, but, I mean, people kind of laugh at that. And there's, I think still value there, but it's historical value. We're not walking into meetings. We're not having judges court order people to go into, like, a 1920s idea of analysis.
Right.
Do you think it has something to do with the idea that the 12 steps kind of enforces the concept of free will and the libertarian sense? Like, I have control over what's happening to me and I can make the change without worrying about what's going on at a neurobiological level or think about the things that are outside of my control.
So one of the common phrases that they use that you hear in the treatment centers a lot is like free will run riot, right? And there's this sort of demonizing idea around, what you should be doing and how you should be thinking, and the fact that you can't make decisions for yourself and that your judgment is impaired, so you don't know how to make choices and things like that. And it's really disheartening working in the treatment industry to see these people come in and have them believe that they don't have a choice, and I really feel like choice is empowering. That being said, I have also sort of alternative ideas about free will. I'm a big fan of David Eagleman. He's a psychologist he's out of Waco, and I think he's in California now, but he thinks about free will as not being a thing, really, and that we are sort of in our own minds and the result of our own mental neurobiological structure. So we butt heads a lot in the treatment community around that, for sure.
Well, and just this idea that people are giving over their free will or, feel like they're helpless to drugs, and so they need to instead turn to a higher power. And, Bill W. introduced this idea that is sort of the spine of the 12 steps, which is that you need to be committed to your higher power. And I know that people will often say things like, your higher power can be yourself, or you get to choose what your higher power is. And this isn't, state-ordered or state-sponsored religion because you get to choose what your higher power is. But I don't know, as a skeptic from the outside, it doesn't feel secular by any means.
Right. That is one of the most frequently debated topics, essentially, in treatment as well, is that people come in and they're like, I don't believe in a higher power. And we tell them all the time, that it's not necessarily you, right? It's not necessarily like, you get to be your own higher power. They don't like that either, because then there's ego involved, and we don't like confidence, of course.
Yeah.
We don't want that.
Not if we're going to keep people sick and keep people coming back, which, if we're being frank, is kind of part of the business model here.
It is. Yeah, 100%. I've had to address the higher power issue several times, and the way that I've gone about it, and the reason that I think it is an integral piece to it is because it's this idea that there's something bigger than us, and that there's something that's beyond our control. Because the treatment industry and the way we think about addiction and the war against drugs and all these things is to impose this idea that we're either the choice model, right? Like we're making bad choices and we don't know how to make choices, or it's somehow within our control and we're bad people, we're addicts, there's a label attached. And when you think of a higher power and think of something bigger and outside of yourself, and you think of giving back or think of being involved with the social movement or something like that, it really gives the individual a sense of A, responsibility for what they can control, and B, relief around the things that they can't. But that's where it gets to be a problem, right? Because if you start to look at addiction as a disease model and sort of indoctrinate these specific ideas, then it becomes a label of, okay, you're an addict, and then there's normal people, and then there's you. And then if you, can't control or manage this disease, then, it runs you.
Right. Yeah. So we know that like drug courts and parole officers and different government agencies often will not only sort of push or fund or direct people towards these types of programs, but actually even require it. And if that's the case, and, we can be on the fence about the religious nature of that and sort of the encroachment there, but is there good reason to? Do the stats, bear that out in any way?
I always caution people with the stats. And my clients used to throw stats at me all the time, like, oh, well, 23% make it or don't make it. Or I'm like, listen, there's not a chance in hell that all these stats are key and on point, and that all this data was, delivered
and
appropriately,
the way it's been collected and
interpreted.
And especially when we're looking at AA, I mean, you could be part of a group that's led locally that's really, really excellent and isn't necessarily founded on all of these ideas, but it's still connected to this larger concept that it feels really problematic.
Yeah, and it is, and it's such a complex, dynamic question, right? Because there's so much involved. If you're talking specifically just about the idea that people are forced to go into treatment by, they're usually not forced into AA, but they're forced to treatment, and then treatment forces them to go to AA by some, programming rules or whatever is involved. So that in and of itself is a problem, right? Because I think the answer is that they just don't know what to do. And it's become this global epidemic and this global or national or whatever problem. And we look at it like that, but we don't want to break it down into the individual specific issues that have arisen, whether it be in academia, like how the helping professionals are trained and their well-being, or who runs these treatment programs and where did they come from, and what are their biases and things like that. If AA worked for them, are they holding on to some ideal and then forcing that down somebody's throat? And are they able to really self-evaluate and see like where they need to have a learning edge involved?
So I'm curious, how does one start a local 12-step program that somebody might be required to go to? Does the person leading it have to have any kind of qualifications or any kind of state or local licensure?
Generally, no. Nope. AA is run by the people that attend AA, and it's run based off the 12-step principles. So it's essentially like, I don't want to say the blind leading the blind, but it's sort of, there's no credentialed, qualified treatment professionals or anything like that involved in the rooms themselves.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a model that, again, might have made a little bit more sense in the Roaring '20s, but just doesn't feel natural now.
Well, it is the 20s again, so.
Right, but less roaring, more, I think, just existential angst and panicking.
Now screaming.
Yeah.
Screaming 20s.
But, as we have these advances in psychopharmacology and neurobiology and these different sorts of things, is there any reason to believe that the 12-step model, still has something to offer?
I think it does. I think that the 12 steps themselves, like I tell everybody, like you could not be an addict or not have any sort of mental illness and still go through the 12 steps and gain something from that.
Sure.
Some sort of self-understanding, some sort of progress towards a goal. I think that the community is really important because the two biggest things that my clients have come in and asked me is how do I love myself and how do I make friends? They generally don't have a support network, and that's like one of the major things. Johann Hari just came out with Lost Connections, this book about depression and how we think about depression and how depression may ultimately be just these lost connections to things and people. And that's really generally what I see in treatment is these lost connections to a sense of purpose, to family support, friends, to themselves, to a healthy well-being, a healthy overall physical being, things like that. So I do think that in that sense, those rooms do provide a sense of belonging and a sense of structure. And the steps themselves are a part of a psychotherapeutic work that they can do. But again, it's like you were saying before, right? Like different rooms have different standards and different people and different groups and things like that. So some of them are great and some of them are not so great. Some of them wind up with sponsors that say that going for mental health counseling is a bad idea and that they shouldn't do that. Some people, they call their sponsor and their sponsor relapse and then they may go relapse. So there's a lot of
and I know
variables.
that peer support is an important part of addiction treatment for a lot of reasons, and you're talking about that sense of connection, and that makes sense to me that you would have other people who have gone through it too, but myself and you as a license holder and somebody who works in healthcare and mental health, it's terrifying to me to think that there is no real oversight or training necessarily, and your sponsor or your group leader or whoever else might be great, but who's to know? Who's to say?
Right. And that's even true in the treatment industry, right? Some of the people that get court ordered to these treatment programs, right? Those treatment programs are going to be dependent on the company culture, who leads that culture, the therapists that they employ, the clinicians, whether or not they work together as a team with the rest of the staff, what sort of modalities they employ. Like they may, state that they do CBT, DBT, and excursions and things like that, acupuncture, whatever it might be. But it's different no matter where you go and no matter what setting you're in, what city you're in. So it's really not standardized. And really, people don't know what they're signing up for when they get sort of shoved into a treatment program.
Yeah. Well, these are definitely scary thoughts and things I want to dive a little bit more into. But before that, let's go ahead and jump on the phones, V.
Yeah. We have got a call from Sergio in Florida. Hello, Sergio. What can we do for you tonight?
Hey there. Thank you guys so much for taking my call. I love the secular sexuality. So it's a big question, and I think I'm actually going to tweak my question a little bit, considering that Kristen is there. So over the years, I might have to give you backstory, but basically, I think growing up in the church with a basically narcissistic father and missionaries for parents, and I learned some very unhealthy thinking patterns, and basically developed sort of. I'll call it an addiction to martyrdom and self-suffering, because I just ended up thinking of myself a certain way. And no matter how much I pushed against the religion, even in college, I still was finding myself in patterns of finding people that were not great for me. And I've never had a relationship that lasted more than 6 months because I just have issues with connection. So the question is basically, I'm interested in somebody now, and it's great, and I have all these amazing feelings, but in a way, I feel broken by all this emotional and spiritual trauma, and it's like so scary to try and even imagine anything with anyone at this point, and it's hard to, because I'm in my own process of healing. No one can fix it. So I'm trying to navigate, how much can I ask of a partner in a relationship to help me with emotional and spiritual trauma? It's a kind of a big question because I don't even know how to go about healing myself, much less I don't want to put a burden on somebody else. So,
Yeah, I definitely hear that. Can I ask you, you say that you're going through your own healing. What does that actually look like in a practical day-to-day sense? What steps have you taken or are you taking right now?
So I basically escaped my family when I went to college and then just kind of did my own thing. And I mean, you start drinking and you start smoking. And so smoking weed and drinking have been kind of almost daily parts of my life for years. And then recently I just come to the conclusion that I'm using it as a crutch. I mean, this is America. Everybody uses drugs, whether it's caffeine, whether it's sugar, or whatever it is. Like, whatever gets you through your day, but if you have to use it responsibly. So I have pretty much stopped smoking weed and stopped drinking. Besides like a beer or two when I just can't handle it. And I'm also in therapy every other week, but just because of financial reasons, I can't really go more often than that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'd say that first off, and I'm probably the least qualified one on this, around this table to talk about this, but first off, I feel like you're a good ways along, I feel like. The fact that you are aware of what your issues might be in this relationship and the fact that you are aware that you don't want to put those burdens on your partner, those by themselves are huge steps that many people don't take. So the fact you are aware of it is already showing me that you are healing and you are able to look at this from an objective standpoint, which is amazing. I don't think that I don't subscribe to the belief that only healthy people deserve relationships.
Absolutely.
Healthy in quotes,
Yeah.
right? Like, you don't have to prove that you can
Right.
function at a certain bar to be granted a relationship by the relationship gods or whatever, Like, everybody deserves to be loved and be supported by people around them. It just depends on how open you are to changing and how open your partner is to helping you through that.
Yeah, I think that those are beautiful points that if you're waiting around until you're ready for a relationship, you may never have one. And there is a little bit of learn by doing. I don't want to be callous in saying this, but without knowing you, without knowing about your relationship, without knowing any of the particulars, I can just look at an almanac and tell you it's probably going to end. And that's totally okay. It can still be a valuable, beautiful relationship that might last 6 months, that might last 6 years, that might last 60 years. There's
Right.
no way of saying, but just know that it's okay if this relationship ends. And again, I don't mean to be blasé about that, but I feel like, especially when people are anxious about their past traumas, they get this sense that if they can't make this relationship work and if this relationship ends, that there's something broken about them and that it's just over for you and this is it and this is your shot. And if you mess it up, then it's over. And I would tell you that most relationships end and most relationships are still very beautiful and fulfilling and wonderful and can lead to the next relationship. People aren't interchangeable, but that doesn't mean that you need to live and die based on how things proceed here and now.
One question I'd like to ask you, Sergio, if that's okay, comes up for me.
Yeah.
Did you have permission to be okay in your past?
That's funny you say that because the person I am seeing now basically said, I need to give myself permission to feel, and that's one of the things that you end up doing just to hide the pain and hide, growing up feeling that no one hears you and that your suffering is invisible. You don't let yourself feel, even like when I'm there with him, we have a great time and then like we go to sleep and I just start crying and because I don't I'm just laying there and then I just start crying because I don't understand how to feel and I don't know like I feel great, I feel amazing. It's like but I just have to let myself experience that without being afraid. So no, I don't think at home I was really allowed to feel. No, not at all.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's a matter of sort of dipping our toe in the water. And I think this happens for a lot of people, like you said. Today, everyone's trying to cut that edge off and sort of numb out something. And that can be a painful thing, but that can also be a pleasurable thing. We move away from joy just as much as we do pain sometimes because it feels different. And just being able to sit with that feeling, even if it, if it does bring up tears at night or anything like that, just being able to sit with it and allowing it to come up and having it feel different, I think is important in any relationship, because that really opens the door for vulnerability too, and recognizing what's going on in the moment so that you can have a new experience.
Right. Yeah. No, I hear that. Thank you.
It definitely sounds like you're taking the right steps.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I just want to praise you and compliment you for the work that you're doing, for working with a therapist, for being willing to have feelings, which can be gross and icky and ridiculous. So, just keep that up. And, for you, that might mean spending some time just getting grounded, spending some time focusing on those emotions, because especially when you've had a traumatic past, especially when that's tied to these religious ideals of stoicism and, being in the world but not of it, and not tied to the desires of the flesh and all of these things that get preached at you over and over again, you can get really alienated from your own emotions. And so taking some time, maybe, setting an alarm on your phone that goes off every 4 hours. And when it beeps, you take 2 seconds to just stop and think, how am I feeling right now in this moment? Not as a way of changing it, not as a way of judging it, but just becoming more aware of those things as they happen.
Okay.
Also, it sounds like you found somebody who is kind of amazing for you. At least from what we've heard, it sounds like there's a person who really wants to get to know the real you and be there for you. And that's a beautiful thing too. And I think that focusing on that and realizing that, there are people out there who do want you to feel exactly the way you feel and to share that and to revel in that with them. I think just focusing on that too, and realizing that, you found somebody for however long it lasts. Like, you've got somebody right now, and to really, really treasure that.
Thank you. I hope I can call again with a different topic, because you guys are honestly my favorite show. And I thought, the intersection of sexuality and gender expression and religion is my whole life. So it's just I could call every week and have an hour. Anyway, thank you guys so much.
Yeah, definitely call back.
We're so glad that you did call. Feel free to send us an email. Jump on our Ask line, 512-666-0ASK. We'd love to hear from you again.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Yeah, I feel like that's something I'm seeing more and more and more in the clients that I work with, is just this sense that they don't even necessarily know how they feel. And when we have that type of trauma, especially when it's couched in all of these religious ideals, it can be so hard to even know if you're happy.
Yeah, and I know for me, I also grew up in a very restrictive religious household where emotion, or certain emotions at least, were not encouraged. And even the positive, quote unquote, positive emotions that were allowed if they were mellow and quiet.
Very muted.
Right.
Yeah, especially as a woman.
Oh yeah, seen and not heard. No, but it's so interesting to me that I've been around so many people and people I know now, feeling emotion strongly is something to apologize for. It feels like you're doing something wrong if you express an emotion loudly or without that apology, either prefacing it or following it. And I think for me, I can trace that right back to a similar background to Sergio's.
Yeah, no question.
I'm glad you bring that up too, because, I think that especially now with, I don't know if you notice how many bipolar medication commercials are on TV. It's like, do you often dig at night? I'm like, yes, I garden in midnight. That's what I do. And this now, because they have so many pharmaceutical drugs on the market to treat bipolar disorder, it's like everybody gets that diagnosis. They come in and they get slapped with the diagnosis, and sometimes they're just having a feeling, and it's a tricky area to navigate in terms of what is a genuine need to help somebody stabilize in life, and then who is just getting over medicated because they're just having true, genuine feelings.
All of a sudden not alienated. I mean,
Right.
that's sort of the model of what we expect from our society. And it makes people good employees. It makes people,
Right.
good members of society.
Conformist, yeah.
To be conformist and muted and numb. So, secular sexuality, express your feelings. So with that, jumping back into this talk about addiction care, I wanted to ask a little bit about sort of the scope of addiction treatment. Clearly, when we're talking about AA, we're talking about alcohol, but beyond that, I feel like there is now obviously NA, but there's also Love and Sex Anonymous, and there are all of these different programs. How did that get started, and is this working?
Really, the treatment industry itself started when the 12-step rooms met medicine, and they started the treatment industry. And in terms of like AA and NA, that's a subset within a subset within a subset of what it is we're talking about. And with modern medicine and everything like that came new problems. So now it's not just, a crack epidemic or an opioid epidemic. It's now chem drugs with different chemistry compositions. It's people that use meth and wind up with chronic, severe, long-term hallucinations. It's just such a wide variety of things that we come across. The legalization of marijuana, it's like new age prohibition or whatever, however you want to look at it, right? And there's all these debates and controversies in terms of what's going on. But I think what it comes down to, the scope, if you want to use like something to narrow that down, is really the disease model and how we think about that. Because, they started the war on drugs, and then we said drugs were bad, and then you saw the frying pan, and this is your brain on drugs. And then we had DARE programs, and those didn't work. And then we had Scared Straight and all these dumb things that didn't work because we stigmatized everything. And then we created this idea about what addiction is and what drug use is, and that it was specific and pertained to these specific things, and that it could be treated in these specific rooms. But now there's people like Mark Lewis, who I really respect and appreciate. He just wrote a book, The Biology of Desire, and he went through AA and the 12 steps and recovery, and he's a PhD in neurobiologist, and he subscribes to the developmental model, because there's all these other models that we don't talk about, because we need to think of it as a disease model, because we need to think that we can treat it with medication, because we need to be able to
sell medication,
right. And the insurance industry and everything else. So I really subscribe to the developmental model, and I'm hoping that the evolution of the industry and the scope moves more in that direction, because I'll see over and over and over again, these people coming into the treatment industry, like they've done it, they've been in 30 times, and they're just like, we know the answers to all the questions. They nap in group, and they know how to get through things, and they stand up like the Manchurian Candidate and stay with the 12 steps and go back to sleep. And we have to be able to evolve, and we have to be able to use new techniques like ketamine treatments and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and maybe moderation-based treatment centers eventually, and things like that, so that we really need to change the scope away from, not necessarily away from the disease model, because there are parts of that I do link together, so to speak.
Sure, that have value.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in a sense, it's still a neurobiological, it's like a brain disease, right? You have the way your brain interacts is essentially, you have to undo it. It is essentially a disease, right? And it's like any other disease. If you had cancer or HIV or anything like that, you would have to treat it. You would have to take care of yourself, and you would have to, at the end of the day, make a choice to do that.
So, is there now, or do you feel like there should be a difference in approaches when we're talking about something that is chemically based, something that does have a, physical chemical dependency, something like alcohol or heroin, as opposed to things that are, I guess, called process addictions, things like gambling or cell phone usage or whatever the most recent celebrity to get caught in trouble with something has.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you can't open up a gossip magazine without finding out that so and so is addicted to such and such, and you're like, chocolate, really? That's addicted too?
Yeah, and I feel like those magazines are really a way to take them down, because that's what that label does.
Sure.
I think that in terms of, like, if you take it from a developmental model perspective, really there's not a whole lot of difference between substance and process addictions. I just worked in a place where the founder was a pioneer in technology addiction, and he did a lot of research on how that develops now. And that's a major field right now, because it's literally changing the way these kids, the next generation's brains develop. And then they're showing up with symptoms like sociopathy or autism-like symptoms that are not genuine diagnosis. They're just, symptoms of how their brains have developed.
Sure.
So what we did as a clinical team, we went in and developed reintegration protocols so that they could learn how to use technology, because in process addictions, right, you can't just stop using the substance, and that's where the difference is. You can't just take away technology. You can't just take away sex. You can't just, stop eating. So that's really the difference in process addictions. But if you look at the neurobiology, it shows up in the same place in the brain, and therefore is a product of the same mechanisms neurobiologically.
Yeah, so moving forward, should we be using these same models? Is there a way to maybe tweak them to these particular products or particular ideas? Or do you feel like it's safe to say that something like cell phone usage should be treated with, a group of people sitting around, hi, I'm a cell phone addict, and, that these same models are appropriate?
So I think in my experience and from my perspective, and sort of in combining all of the different layers of things that I've learned over the years, it really comes back to our physical being and who we are and our connection to ourselves. And I think that, for technology, if you're going to use that as an example, creating the community and the sort of mindfulness, meditation-based connection to the world is really important. And I think that's true for anything, because it's sort of like what our caller was talking about, having that connection to feeling alive, whether that feels painful or not, is the thing that we avoid, whether it be process or substance or anything like that. And it's interesting because it seems so simple, right? Like who doesn't want to be happy? But sometimes we wind up being happy and we don't like it because it feels weird, and we're like, gotta kill it, gotta kill it. So I think it really comes back to us on an individual level and treating the individual. And some of the things that they have evidence-based wise is mindfulness meditation is a big one, just because of the impact it has on your prefrontal cortex. And then psychotherapy, they say, is one of the best ways to treat it, is to go to an individual therapist and talk about the things you don't want to say in real life.
Do you have any concerns about treating, gambling or out-of-control sexual behavior, for instance, through this same lens that we would use for something that has a chemical dependency component? Is it problematic to be talking about gambling or sexuality the same way we talk about heroin, for instance?
I don't know if it's problematic. I think what's problematic is that we wind up trying to treat everything with a medication. And I think anytime we put something synthetic into our body that's supposed to compensate for something we're not already making, our body's going to react to that. So whether it be, gambling or whatever, and we're trying to take an antidepressant or whatever it is, I think that gets to be the problem, rather than trying to find holistic ways to build those restores back up in our body and ourselves. I think that if you're doing it from an outdated, like the AA 12-step model, it still provides the connection and community and things like that. So I don't, you would treat them differently. You would treat gambling differently than you would treat heroin, because you have a different physiological reaction to those things, and a different basis for why this addiction developed in this specific person. So you would treat that specific person based on their specific experiences.
Those particular things, sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, because I'm kind of coming at this from somebody who doesn't have the background of actually working with addiction or studying it. And for me, I'm wondering if I could take your last question and kind of
Sure.
Tweak it. Are there concerns about talking about things like gambling or sex addiction in the same way we tend to talk about addiction to heroin? So, because I feel like ideally no person would be stigmatized because of what they're going through. But have you seen people who maybe are resistant to the diagnosis because of the stigma around the word?
So I've seen both directions. I've seen people relieved. They're like, oh, I know the answer now. I know I have this problem. And that's true for a lot of things. I'm sure you've seen it in your practice. If somebody's diagnosed with PTSD or depression, like, oh, I have these symptoms, and this is why I have these symptoms. So for some people, there's relief. For some people, there's self-deprecating, self-defeating, self-doubting. Oh, this is who I am, and you're normal, and I'm not, and I'll never be normal because of this. And that's really where that problem would come in terms of labeling and things like that.
Okay.
I think you hit on a good point, though, and that is maybe what concerns me is just the usage of the word addiction. And I kind of do wish that we had maybe an alternate word or another word that we could use just to differentiate between, what your body might be going through versus the habits that you formed.
Right. Kind of like the way cult has become a word that is sensationalized because we only hear about it when something big and awful happens.
Right.
So you're like, oh, I can't be in a cult because that's Jim Jones. That's not me. So I feel like there's a similar link socially between words like that. Oh, this isn't me because that's sensationalized and I'm not.
And that is a huge problem that we have as a society with psychology, because all of the derogatory terms that we have now came from clinical diagnosis from 30 to 100 years ago.
Which is really, really frustrating for me. I mean, I want to hear you say more about that, but, words that I might use based on like their actual clinical definition, I wouldn't dare say in front of a client, because I know that if I say that, for instance, you're psychotically oriented or more psychotically oriented, people are going to think that I am picturing them, stabbing people and, Christian Bale with a chainsaw and like this kind of thing, when that's certainly not what I'm talking about. And, the founder of this show likes to talk about sort of the Oprahization of healthcare and how by offering these concepts to people in more like bite-sized, manageable packages, that everybody's become something of an expert, which I think is valuable, but also really problematic.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. I think that, anybody that's taken a Psych 101 class is like, oh, well, I know what your problem is. You got,
he's a narcissist.
Yes, I was just going to say, especially with narcissism, like everybody's a narcissist. These are the signs. Like, okay, well, not everybody is, and I think that, the DSM itself it's a diagnostic and statistical manual. Like that's what it is. It's organized packages, groupings of symptoms that people observed over time, and then we're trying to find a way to treat them. But within those packages are, lots of dynamics that happen, and it's not, you can wear it like a badge, or you can, wear it like a death sentence. It really doesn't matter. And people, I think, they misinterpret that a lot, and I think that's problematic for sure.
Well, finally, as we're talking about, I guess, sort of the difference between these types of addictions or whatever terminology we want to use, you mentioned how the same, like, reward centers in the brain or these same parts of the brain are being activated. And I guess I just kind of wanted to follow up on what that actually means, because I hear people talk about the reward center or about how, different parts of the brain light up when they're exposed to different things. And how scientific is it to say that, kittens and heroin activate the same parts of the, what are we talking about here?
So what we're talking about is really neuroimaging. And when we talk about the brain, the brain or the mind or however you want to conceptualize it is so complex that we often use oversimplified terms and ideas to describe it just so that it's digestible and that we can actually have a conversation about it.
Sure.
And when we're talking about the brain lighting up, it's essentially like blood flow to that region of the brain is what you're seeing. Like glucose and energy is transmitted in the brain as blood flow, and you can see it light up on an fMRI. These areas are indicative of activity when we see a kitten, right? So when we're studying the brain and things like that, what we're really talking about is neural electrical signals in the brain, and those signals are releasing neurotransmitters. When we're talking specifically about addiction, it's really goal-oriented behavior, and the areas involved in that are the prefrontal cortex and the striatum or nucleus accumbens, and then we have dopamine being released in that area. So what happens is that, especially with addiction, is that over time, the prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens or striatum essentially stop talking. They get disconnected. There's a lack of electrical activity between those two centers, which is fine because if you stop taking that substance, those things can then turn back on because the mind we now know is flexible, which before we thought, if brain cells died, you'd never get them back and things like that. That's not true. We are constantly evolving and using different parts of our brain. So when those areas are speaking, it's oriented towards goal-oriented behavior and motivation. So essentially, you become more and more and more and more focused on one goal, for lack of more complicated concept.
Sure.
And so that's especially true with addiction because it's you have the environment giving you a stimulus, and that stimulus is setting off that area in the brain, and then you're going to go seek whatever is related to that stimulus. And that can be anything. That can be fitness, that can be food, that can be kittens, that can be anything, right? It could be your phone, it can be coffee. And so over time, it becomes a developmental issue. So when we're developing, it's a totally normal, natural thing, right? Like when we're growing up between the ages of 4 and 20, we have a synaptic overgrowth, and then we have synaptic pruning. So as we're having experiences growing up, our brain is pruning away different synapses, like you would see vines on a tree, sort of orient themselves. And then our mind is functioning and operating based on those experiences and the genetics expressed, which is why, David Eagleman would say we don't have free will because we are subject to that specific synaptic pruning.
Right.
However, if we keep moving forward and we introduce novelty and learning, I think Mark Lewis says there's a study about London cab drivers. They have the most synaptic.
I've read that, yeah.
Yeah, because they have to keep learning and they have to learn these streets. So it is flexible, and they find that people who absolve from substances actually wind up having an increase in understanding and learning in that synaptic activity.
Interesting. So I've got a question that may or may not be relevant. Is workaholic an actual thing then?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Because think that's the goal, right?
Right. Okay.
And everything
I'm
else
understanding
sort of
a lot about
falls-
myself right now.
Yep, you can equally become addicted to work.
To working.
Sure.
Okay.
I just want to point out that an English major is talking about being a workaholic when there's no such thing as workahol, but that's my
I was a journalism
separate
major,
issue.
excuse you.
Okay, my mistake.
Them's fighting words.
Okay. Well, with that, why don't we put that journalistic mind to work and jump back into our emails?
Okay. All right. I'll accept that as a segue.
Right? Yeah, okay.
That's acceptable.
Yeah, professional on air here.
All right. So we got an email from Evan. And Evan says, I don't identify as transgender, but I have been diagnosed with dysphoria. Most of my discomfort is with my physical feminine characteristics, basically all of them, but I still feel like this is me, quote unquote, not being like other girls. I'm on the autism spectrum and have struggled to fit in with peer groups, especially female ones, and having recently discovered that I am bi/pansexual, I started to think about what gender means to me. I'd probably describe my situation as not being good at gender in the social sense. And I just want to pause here real quick and say that more than anything, that line is yeah, this isn't just a phase. This isn't you not like other girls. If you can phrase it that well, just not being good at gender, then yeah, you've done some thinking on a level that probably indicates that it's not just a phase. But, who knows? Continuing, I've had fantasies about turning into a guy for years, but I don't feel like I'm masculine enough to transition. And while I think I'd be happy to wake up one day as male, the process of transition terrifies me. Mm-hmm. I like wearing men's clothes, and I have been binding and intend to get top surgery this summer because I've been sure about it for a long time, but going on hormones is too intimidating. I don't feel like I fit under any non-binary labels either. They're either too specific, like gender fluid, or too general, like transmasculine. I'm worried that this is just another phase of me trying to explain why I feel uncomfortable with myself. I think it's possible that my thoughts on my gender may change, so I don't want to make any irreversible decisions. I have sought counseling for gender stuff specifically, but nobody seems to really know what to make of my situation. I'm transferring to a new university this semester, and I could get a chance to establish myself as someone new, But again, most of my problems are with my physical body and not with my social role, since I've always kind of eschewed gendering my behavior anyway. Also, points for using eschewed in an email. I know I'm not supporting the not English major theory right now.
Yeah,
but,
got it.
I'm not even sure if finding a label would help me. My plan is to take things slow, but I don't even know where to start. I would love advice on what steps I can take to figure things out without labeling myself or coming to definitive and final conclusions about who or what I am.
Wow, so that's a lot to take in. And as you already pointed out, something that's obviously been really carefully considered.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really important thing for us to honor. And Evan and everybody else who's listening, as we kind of talk about this, I guess I want to just acknowledge that we're strangers over the internet. We know 3 paragraphs about you and have, some insight that we want to offer, especially for the folks who maybe haven't done this same level of exploration.
Right.
And so I think there's real value in talking about that. But I also just want to acknowledge that we're not here to diagnose you or to label you. We can't give you a blood test and tell you your official gender. Certainly not at all, but especially not over a email or anything along those lines.
Right. And before I say anything more, I do want to stress that nobody should be forcing you to pick one label and stick to it for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. That's not an expectation that anyone should put on you or that you should put on yourself. If you find a label that really works for you, that's awesome. I also have friends who are all over the gender spectrum who do not label and who actively resist finding labels because they feel like that goes against the whole point. A lot of them just use the blanket umbrella term queer, and that's something I do as well. I'll either do that or get super, super specific and weird. But from these 3 paragraphs alone, and from what I understand about myself being non-cis and having and interacting with trans friends, this sounds very much like what I hear from my trans friends. Mm-hmm. It sounds very much like you don't have to want to transition in order to justifiably call yourself trans if that's something you want to do. You don't have to get on hormones. You don't have to have top or bottom surgery. There's no expectation beyond accepting the label if that's what makes you feel right and good. So you are free to use whatever label you want. You do not have to commit to one. That can very easily change over time. But I also want to acknowledge that when I first came out to myself as first bi and then as genderqueer, because that happens, you think, oh, I'm attracted more to more than one gender. Oh, how many genders are there? Okay, now I have to. And then it just breaks down. So when I first started coming out, I felt like I was an imposter. I felt like I can't call myself these words. I can't call myself part of these communities because I don't feel like I fit in yet. I don't feel like I've either gone through the same level of oppression that I've seen other people go through. Mm-hmm. I personally don't have body dysphoria. I do have social dysphoria. But that was a hurdle that I had to get over as well. Like, I don't suffer from this. This isn't something that I consider to be part of my experience. Do I get to use these words? And I want to make sure that you understand that you are welcome to use those words. They are yours as much as they are anyone else's if you want them. And there are no hurdles, there are no requirements for suffering in order to justify your inclusion into a community. I feel like that's one thing I get on all the time is like, if you make suffering a requirement to be part of a community, that's inherently making that community equivalent to suffering, which is not at all what we want to do. We want to experience and celebrate everything amazing and wonderful and fulfilling about being part of these communities. So yeah, I could go on about this all night.
Yeah,
but,
beautifully said, honestly. Like, I could let you go on all night because you seem to have your finger on the pulse of this.
I hope I'm not speaking out of turn. I think that what you said resonated with me, and it resonates with how I understand is a similar thought process in the non-cis community. And if you want to be part of it, welcome. You're here. You're part of it. That's all you need to do. And if you want to go get top surgery, That's awesome. Congratulations. That seems like a big step, but it seems like something you're ready to do and you've thought about. But you don't need to meet a checklist of requirements in order to be included. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really don't have anything to add to that. You start your letter by saying, I don't identify as transgender, and so I'm going to respect that and let you come to the label, come to the idea that matches your feelings and your desires. But I just have to echo V in saying that there isn't a barrier to entry, that you don't owe anybody HRT, you don't owe anybody bottom surgery or any of these other complications in order to be sufficiently trans. You also don't have to get beat up. You don't have to be kicked out of your household. I mean, these are not things that should be markers of the queer community. Sadly, they are, and as somebody who works mostly with the queer community, I eventually started to also sort of specialize in healing from religious shame and trauma because those two things just go together so well. We're here every week talking about it, but that's not the way I want it to be, and that's not the way that it is for everybody, nor should it be. So, yeah, you can join the club if you want to. You're definitely welcome.
And I do want to just validate the fact that you don't know the term yet that works for you. We don't have language around this yet. This is the fact we have more than 2 words to describe certain people is revolutionary and makes a lot of people uncomfortable, but it's becoming more and more accepted especially online. But yeah, we don't have words for everything yet. So it could just be that what you are, we don't have a word for yet. And it's a shame that we haven't lived in a culture that allowed us to develop that vocabulary and to create these terms. But just because you don't have a specific word for it doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist. You exist regardless of whether or not that label exists yet.
It's so well said, and it's so grateful to hear you speak about it, because it's really not something that the languaging and things that I'm used to interacting with, but you really nailed on the 3 things that came up for me, and one of them being that fitting into that checklist. Like in hearing the email, what comes up for me is this finality, this having to arrive, right?
Right.
And I think that's
like your gender will be complete and gender accomplished
Yeah.
at a certain
Yeah.
stage in your journey.
Yeah, and I wonder like what that means for this individual to have to define it, and if they did define it, what would that mean for them? The other thing that comes up is redefining yourself, by going to school and things like that. And I love that stuff. Like I love like a new level and a new phase in life. Like I very much support like just detaching from old ideas and detaching from the outcome and just figuring out where you're at. Like I'm a big proponent of that, and you can do that every single day, and you can change your mind every single day if you really want to. There's nobody telling you that it needs to be otherwise. And I didn't do a resolution. I did more of like a lifetime revolution this year than anything else. And for me, the idea of I'm not going to do anything until I'm ready to do it is really where I'm at, and I'm going to sit with it as long as I need to sit with it, and I'm going to wrestle with it, and I'm going to come up with whatever terms or invent my own terms or whatever I need to do that feels like it lands well and grounds me in a space that feels like the next best step forward. So I would encourage you to play with that, reinvent yourself every day, and don't take on anything until you absolutely feel like you're ready, and you'll know when you are. I think that everybody does know. I have a friend in Florida who just put out a really awesome post about how, have you ever said yes to something immediately, like whether it be a relationship or a job, and you just went, yep, that's the thing, that's what I want, and people are like, oh, that's impulsive. And I think it's decisive, So that point being like, when you're ready.
And there's no timeline. There's no expected, okay, first you do this, then you do this at this time and this at this time. You are your own timeline, and there's nothing, there is no way that people can make you feel bad for being quote unquote behind or too far ahead. It's you. Listen to what you are telling yourself, and it sounds like you're doing a lot of amazing introspection already. So hopefully this helped, Evan. Thank you so much for writing.
Yeah, and we would love to hear from you again. So, if
Yes.
you'd like to send us a follow-up email, if you'd like to even call into the show, we're happy to keep you as anonymous as you'd like to be. But we'd love to just hear maybe your reaction or how maybe some of this resonates with you or doesn't, because I think we're all very open to being challenged about that and more curious about your journey than any particular, narrative or object that we have.
Right.
So.
And best of luck at that new university. That's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I feel like my entire life since high school has been punctuated by moving to new places and starting over. It's a thrilling feeling. I love it.
Yep.
Yeah, y'all very much have that in common, whereas I'm currently sitting like maybe an hour from where I grew up.
There's nothing wrong with
And
that
I
either,
have no intention of leaving.
Oh my goodness. I just got my Google Maps timeline review for 2019.
Goo.
Which at first was very creepy. I was like, how does Google know exactly where I've been all the time? That's disturbing.
They know everything.
I've traveled 50% of the way around the world. Just timeline.
Just in that year?
Just that year.
Good goddamn.
Yeah.
All right.
So just thought I'd share.
That sounds
I'm
like
proud
fun.
of that.
Very
we should
soft
talk later.
brag.
I wanna
Very
hear stories
soft
about
brag. Separate podcast. Atheist Adventures.
Hey, don't give me ideas for a
Yes.
fourth. I don't need a fourth show. Do not tempt me.
I've always wanted to find a way to make money driving around the country and talking about things. So
There you go.
Well, okay, so back to the interview. I guess I wanted to know if you feel like there is any different ways that we should be viewing these different types of addiction, if there's any value. I mean, I pointed out that my problem is just our maybe overextension of one specific word, but as somebody who's actually been there and gotten your hands dirty, do you feel like that's off base? Is it worthwhile to sort of keep things in one box?
I don't think that. I think I want to break the box down, blow that box up. I think that, again, we need to do things completely different than the way that we've been doing them because evolution and development are a thing and things do change and times do change. I think that, again, it's different for different people, When I first started out in the industry, I worked in an eating disorder clinic, and I've done probably every role you can imagine and done all in schooling and in work, in treatment. And I always found that there was always an underlying cause to how the addiction developed. And so when we're talking about labels and types of addictions and things like that, I don't really see those things other than symptoms or indicators of how you might be managing trauma or stress or depression or developmental experiences or adverse childhood experiences, things like that. So I think that if the treatment industry itself could expand its viewpoint a little bit, that we would go a lot further in helping people. People come into treatment and they only have, 2 months. That's 8 weeks. That's 8 sessions in private practice. That's 8 weeks of assessment.
Yeah.
And in treatment industry, it's get them in, get them out, get them fixed. No person heals or changes or grows or develops in 8 weeks like you do, but not to the level that we need to completely restructure your brain. And it's different and we put all of these people in one place and they all, it's meth and heroin and cross addiction and dual diagnosis and all these things. We put them in one box and put them in one place and we treat them with the same thing and expect them to be okay. And then we charge them, $20,000 to do it.
Right.
And the other problem is that the only people that are receiving this care are people that show up for it and that pay for it.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
So if what I'm hearing from you is correct, and I guess I want to check in on this, it's less about the thing that people are addicted to, if we're going to continue using that word, and more just what brought them there. And so maybe we should even be categorizing people, and categorizing people's problematic idea, but in terms of fitting people to treatment modalities or whatever else, it's more about what led them to this point. I mean, what their experiences were, that maybe the trauma that they had or the things that led to these problematic behaviors.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way that I look at it is, if you want to do away with the word addiction, I usually phrase it as a movement towards something, or a movement away from something, and it's a repetitive movement, and then that repetitive movement becomes ingrained, and that's really what addiction is what we're talking about. But yeah, I think that's why it's so hard to treat, because it is about underlying causes and is about everybody's individual story, and that doesn't get addressed when you have 35 people in a room
Sure.
that don't know each other and probably don't like each other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you pointed out just sort of the barriers to entry, the way that the model currently works in terms of who can afford treatment and what that treatment looks like, and session limits and all of these other complications. Do you have any like policy or priority concerns as far as legislation or research or the way insurance works or any of these sorts of things?
I mean, yeah, that could be another
A whole
whole
separate
other
podcast.
How long do we have?
Sure, yeah.
I'm actually working toward developing a nonprofit organization that is going to get mental health professionals together to have these conversations, because I think the biggest issue across all those lines is the way we have conversations. I think that people have a very difficult time having conversations these days, and we're trying to solve these huge, massive global problems, and we're trying to generalize the problems and the solutions. And I think that if we all could get together and have conversations and talk to each other in a way that comes from a place of learning, not a place of getting our point across, not a place of juxtaposing two ideas or having to get your opinion to be right or wrong, I think it has to do with that. And I think if we could have more constructive, effective conversations and learn from each other, then there's a chance for change.
Mm-hmm. So with all of that being said, if somebody is currently struggling with addictive behavior, if somebody is having issues with, alcohol or other substance abuse or anything along those lines, and they look at AA and they do feel like it's a cult, what would you recommend? I mean, what are the maybe the better alternatives than, Celebrate Recovery or AA or those kinds of things?
So yeah, there's lots of groups available. I would always recommend that people try on different things. If you go to AA and you hate it and you feel like it's a cult, don't try to force yourself into that. That doesn't make sense, right? I think that...
I feel like that message is so different than what most folks are hearing. It's like if you go to an AA meeting and you don't like it, good. You're not supposed to like it. You're an addict.
Right, exactly.
Right, and that's exactly how it's treated. You can't make choices. Your judgment is poor. You did this to yourself. Like, you're flawed. And yeah, we're all flawed. We're human. If you want to really get down to it,
sure.
We're human. And I think that that's the most unfortunate part about it. In terms of resources, I know of somebody actually in this community who started an app called In Common. And his goal is to collect data about the industry to figure out what's working and what's not working. And he's creating like a social community so that people have like access immediately to all different kinds of resources. So, they say in treatment, and this is true, is that there's a small window where people are willing to show up and go and change their lives. And I think that's true for everybody, not just in treatment, right? Is that you have this window where you're like, today's the day, I'm going to go do it, right?
Yep.
I'm going to make a change. And if the hard part is when that window passes. So I think that's what's really cool about this In Common app is that it's one-click access to, hey, I need help. And has an array of different things. And it has AA on there, has smart recovery and treatment industries and things like that. But, for you, it may be acupuncture. It may be, I would always recommend going to an individual therapist. I'm a little biased because I'm an individual therapist, but I think that that's the best place to start because it's a safe, private, non-biased room where you can at least get a referral in the right direction. So.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's a lot of ground covered. I'll definitely make sure to include links to some of the things that we've been talking about. And you're saying that, personal individualized therapy and these different approaches is the best step. I guess I just also want to take a moment and acknowledge to the audience that we've been talking about addiction for going on an hour now. And for a lot of folks, that can be really triggering.
Yeah.
So I want to encourage anybody who has made it this far, particularly if you are in recovery, if this is bringing something up for you, to reach out to these different types of resources. There are a number of different hotlines and a number of different things that I think can be incredibly valuable. And I will make sure to include links to some of the things that we've been talking about, some of the books that you've referenced and stuff like that in the footnotes to this episode. But is there anything else that you might recommend to somebody who, right now is listening to this and feeling very alone?
It's definitely hard to ask for help, I think, for anyone. And especially if we're feeling alone, it's hard to say, hey, I'm not okay, and I don't know what to do about that. There are definitely crisis hotlines and things like that you can reach out to. But I mean, just reaching out to the resource that's in front of you. Like if it's this podcast and you're listening to this right now, like feel free to send a message and ask for help, and we can get you in a direction, you know, that you need to be going in. I'm totally open to people emailing me on my website. I'd be happy to clarify anything if you are struggling, because I know it's hard to get like these major concepts across in like a few sentences. And you know, just locally reach out, do a Google search, Psychology Today, whatever pops up, whatever resonates, whatever feels right. Don't force yourself into something that feels uncomfortable. If it's there and it's access to it and you're ready for change, take action. And that's really the best thing I can say, I think, about that.
It would be a good time to bring up the Secular Therapy Project as well. I don't believe they specialize specifically in addiction.
But finding the right
kind of
secular
counselor, especially
yeah.
individual ones, and ones that will approach their treatment of you in a scientific and rational way, as opposed to appealing to higher power or some kind of woo-woo. That's something to check out as well.
Yeah, so seculartherapyproject.org, as well as recoveringfromreligion.org. Great resources, especially if you're looking for somebody to talk to right now. You know, I would also say, of course, to lean on your ACA, your atheist community here in Austin, whether that's, you know, in person or jumping onto our Facebook page or into the Discord or whatever else. We get together and do this for a reason. You know, I've told this joke before, but my dad used to ask me, like, why do atheists have meetings? What do they get together and talk about? Like how there still isn't a God? We have this community to support one another. And if that's you right now, please let us know. I mean, we're happy to be a part of your community, and that's the type of thing that we're all here struggling to form, and we want to include you in it. So with that, I think we've got time for just one more call before we wrap up.
Sure. Let's go to Miguel in New Mexico. Hello, Miguel. How are you tonight?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing good. I see you've got a question about avoiding addiction.
Yes. I just, while being on YouTube, I came upon some videos that were talking about some people think they're addicted, or maybe they are addicted to porn. Mm-hmm. And that made me think of alcohol, weed, and other things that we know are definitely addictive to some people. And it just started making me wonder, how do you avoid addiction? What's a good, like, you can partake in alcohol and different things without getting addicted. So how do you responsibly partake of different things? Like with porn, their answer is avoid it altogether.
Right.
And that sounds like the cult I came out of. And I'm just like, that doesn't seem to make sense. Mm-hmm. So what is a measured, responsible way to partake of anything that is sane to partake of, that's not addictive?
That's a good question.
In itself.
So I think that the key element to it is it causing clinically significant distress is what we use in the field, and sure. Is it a detriment to your life? Are you losing time? Are you not paying bills? Are you not leaving your house? Things like that. I think there's a tendency for us to look at other people and go, oh well, I don't do that, but I definitely do more than this, and I don't think those comparisons are really useful or helpful. I think that it's important to look at ourselves and our own lives and how we interact with the world. And if we're using it as an escape or using it to avoid other things in our lives, to really take a look at whatever the addiction, whatever the substance is numbing us out to. And I think that that's a good indicator. And I think that people are capable generally of, and I think they're the experts in their own lives and are capable of figuring that out for themselves. For the most part.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that in order for something to be an issue, it has to cause a problem.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think that's a good point to make, because I came from a very strict religious background where if you looked at and enjoyed porn at all, it was a porn addiction, mm-hmm. right? And I know I have multiple guy friends and who have come like crying to me to confess their addiction to porn, and I'm like, I know you well enough to know you don't have like this problem, But yeah, the enjoyment of something outside of what is religiously sanctioned tends to be called addiction very quickly, in my experience. So I love that you brought that up, that it is, you should look at it when it starts interfering with the way you actually function in the world.
Yeah, and they, you can get into a slippery slope of like, high functioning alcoholics or things like that, and people say things like everything in moderation and things like that, but that's going to be specific to you, right? Like, people think about like chronic masturbation or things like that, right? And masturbation's a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing to do, and it's totally natural and it's totally normal. But if you're doing it for 16 hours a day and you're not leaving your house, that's a problem, right? Like, so it's really just judging how it's impacting your life.
A lot of that reminds me of a few months ago, a report that the CDC was trying to label video game addiction as an actual certifiable thing, and so many of me and other gamers were just like, what are you talking about? But really, it's how is it impacting your life,
Yeah, I would definitely hesitate to take the word of a media outlet in terms of when
the news wants to call everything an addiction all the time.
They have an addiction to it.
We want to pathologize it.
No, and that's for sure true. In specifically as you're talking about pornography, I would tell you that if you have concerns about your porn use, then it might be worth looking into, and I might encourage you to check out something, for instance, like Ethical Porn for Dicks by Dr. David Lay. He was actually on the show a couple of months back and spoke about how we do tend to demonize our sexuality and how we can responsibly be consuming these things without it being problematic, and that we don't need to feel this constant shame or, God looking over our shoulder and judging our decisions and things along those lines. So if you're feeling anxious, maybe running it through that filter, looking at somebody who has really examined the problem, who has looked at the research, and who can maybe describe for you what quote-unquote healthy use might include, just to make sure that you are working and operating within your own sense of morality and your own sense of what's causing an issue. Is something causing distress? And maybe holding yourself up to that particular mirror would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I just started wondering about it because people were talking about it on Reddit and saying their experiences, and I'm just like, if this is actually a thing, how do I avoid that? Because I don't feel it's affecting my life at all right now.
Yeah.
But I don't want to just assume it never will, if it is actually something to be concerned about.
Well, and we've covered this on this show a number of times, and so I would sort of encourage you to take a look, particularly at that episode with Dr. Lay and some of the other things on this topic of, quote, sex addiction or porn addiction, because it really is a religiously based sort of moralizing understanding of our sexuality and of our porn use. We've talked a little bit tonight about what actually constitutes an addiction and whether or not those words are appropriate, but I would definitely tell you that, there are people who have wasted their entire lives and damaged their relationships and spent all of their money with really out of control sexual behavior and absolute obsessive use of things like pornography. By its own merit, though, I would say that porn is not addictive. In the way that we've been talking tonight, we're kind of playing with that word, but I would tell you that there's not a fear that you're going to, like, if you use it a little bit too much, then you're going to get hooked, and next thing you know, you're going to be totally unable to control it. That concept of addiction just should not apply here in any way.
That's what I thought, because I've been watching porn since I was 13. I'm not addicted at 27. I don't think I'm going to be.
If it was going to happen.
Well, it sounds like you're trying to cultivate an awareness, too, and I think that's what's most important is the curiosity. As long as we stay curious and evaluate and look into things, then that's how, I wouldn't even use the word avoid, but that's how we come to understand our own behavior patterns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and see what it is that we might become addicted to,
Right.
So, yeah.
So, again, if it's not causing a problem, it shouldn't be an issue. Enjoy your porn, enjoy your cell phone, your kittens, your whatever else. But just keep an eye on yourself. And I again would encourage you to check out particularly the works of Dr. David Lay if you are kind of struggling uncomfortably with, what is too much and those sorts of things.
That's a great question, though. Thank you so much for calling in, Miguel.
No problem. What was the doctor's name again for the book Ethical Porn for Dicks?
David Lay, Ley, I believe. And he's been on the show before, and he's got some great work that we've referenced a number of times. So I hope you'll check it out.
No problem. I certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we are really far afield, covering a lot of ground tonight.
We really did. This was I enjoyed this conversation a lot.
I'm very grateful you guys had me on. This is a blast for me. I really enjoyed it. I love having these conversations.
Yeah, it's honestly the most neurobiology that I've been fascinated to hear in a very long time. So thank you so much for making that a possibility. And I guess we want to tell people where they can find out more about you. You told me about you mentioned your website. That's mysoundingboard.co.
Yes, yeah, mysoundingboard.co. All of my links to my social media are on there. There's a call to action button. You can click it. You can send me a question. You can find me on social media. You can send me a question on there. Feel free to contact me.
Wonderful. And you can contact Secular Sexuality with either how you like the episode, what we should talk about next, who you suggest we have on as a guest, or telling your own stories about the intersection of sex and religion in your life. We're on Task World. I'm in work mode. Twitter
You-aholic.
Yep. At Secular Sex on Twitter. Or you can call our voice mailbox at 512-666-0ASK. That's 512-666-0275.
All right. And with that, I guess I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. I know we covered some potentially uncomfortable ground, and so I hope that you're taking care of yourself, that you're reaching out when needed, and that you'll continue to join us week after week. We really appreciate everybody who is sending us emails, everybody who's calling in, and just being a part of this community that we're all excited to build. So thank you so much for being here, and I guess with that, we'd like to encourage you to go and give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or better yet, give somebody else one.
And
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?
No, you're done.